So, transcending objectified notions of the absolute. I worked extensively with Ashok Gangadine at Haverford College, and in my studies with him there, one of the things we talked about was how if we look across the planet, that we find in various spiritual traditions, religions, philosophies, that these wisdom teachers have identified that there is some primal force, that there is some first principle. And one of the themes that we discover is that it's infinite. There's some kind of infinite primal force that is self-caused, that is all-presencing. And it's that theme I really want to hone in on and really ask, well, how do we think and talk about something that's so vast, something that's so infinite? Can we do that? Is our thought powerful enough to do that? And I think this has a lot of implications in terms of interfaith dialogue, especially now with the advent of a global age and the information age. How do we have dialogue across these worldviews and interpret them appropriately? And how do we end the violence that's been going on with that? And so the first thing I want to look at is I looked at a book, The Network of Thought, by Jiddu Krishnamurti, where he talks about that if we really examine something, first thing is that we have experiences. We have experiences, these experiences give us knowledge. That knowledge is stored in the brain as memory. Memory is the basis for thought. So from there, our actions derive from thought, and our actions then create new experiences. And I really want to hone in on that little section between memory and thought. Because how is that knowledge really stored? In psychology, there's what's called semiotic activity, or semiosis. The idea that we have some X to stand in for some Y. It's representational thinking. We use a sign. So in other words, I don't have water here, but saying the word water won't get you wet. The idea of water won't get you wet. Only water itself will. In other words, that our thought is really just a picture, a sign from the past, and it's not the thing itself. And so if we're using thought to think about something like God, or the Absolute, or the Tao, we're really approaching it from a very limited perspective, because we're approaching it from the past. If knowledge if knowledge leads to memory, and memory leads to thought, and we're using thought to think about God, something that's infinite, something that's all-presencing, we're using a limited approach to think about something that's so grand. And so in that sense, it's limited. Furthermore, I argue that thought, anything thought touches, it has to make it an object. It objectifies it, sees it as separate from itself. It wants this knowledge. It wants to become an object of knowledge. And when you do that to something as vast and grand as the infinite, as God, you objectify it. You put it in the box. So even if we look at the Tao Te Ching, the very first line is, the Tao that is named is not the Tao. In other words, that infinite force, you could say, the cosmic consciousness that is put in the box of thought, of memory, is not the thing itself. From there, because thought judges and acts based on memory, signs, in other words, which is from the past, and knowledge, which is limited, any idea of God or the Absolute from that perspective is limited and incomplete, and it tries to make it an object of knowledge. But I wonder, can a primal force really be an object of knowledge in that sense? And in talking about this, how do we avoid relativism? You know, we don't want to say that all religions are saying the same thing. That would be a problem. Each has its own tradition. And just based on common sense, I'm a New Yorker, so the way I think is, well, if something's infinite, why didn't people just think, well, everyone's just touching a different part of it? Why is everyone having these claims to ultimacy of, no, this is mine, and we start fighting over it? So that's another question that I bring up here. And so when we look at something like God and the absolute from this standpoint, I argue, well, first of all, I guess let me backtrack. One of the things that I talk about in my paper, to back this up, is Descartes' ontological proofs of God. How, for example, he thinks that, well, if I'm a finite being, how can I really think of something that's infinite? I can't be the author of something infinite. Is just one of his proofs. From there, I move on to Nishida Kitaro, the founder of the Japanese school of Zen philosophy, who talks that the absolute, for it to be truly absolute, has to negate itself. What the heck does that mean? Right? What he was saying is that if the absolute asserts itself, I'll just use the word God. I know there's a lot of connotations, but if I just use the word, if God asserts himself as this is me, this is it, this is everything I am, then in a sense that creates some kind of singularity, because now everything else that's apart from that, well, it really can't exist. So what Nishida was saying is that, and if you look actually at the story of Adam and the fall of Adam, why was sin so significant? Sin was significant because this idea of, I'm asserting myself. I'm asserting my own space. I'm apart from you, God. I've got the knowledge now. Right? So it's this idea of this self-assertion, of I'm my own independent, self-caused entity by myself. And so if we look at that in the same way, what Nishida is saying is that if you do that, or if we have a conception of the absolute that's like that, then everything else falls away, and it's just that. So he's saying the absolute self-negates itself. It self-cleanses itself. There's no concretized notion of God. Because if there was, then nothing else could be it. To illustrate this, I like to use the Zen koan, where a Zen master gave a fan to two of his students. And the first student took the fan and he started fanning the master with it. Okay, good response. He gave the fan to the second student. The second student, he put a rice cake on the fan and then served it to his master. Somehow he sensed he was hungry. How he did that, I don't know. Maybe the stomach's master would grumble, I don't know. Anyway, the idea was, and you know, the master was ecstatic of this. The idea is that the first student, he got this fan, and he was conceptually imprisoned by the notion of what a fan is and what it's supposed to be. So this is a fan. Oh, this only has one purpose, one function. The second student, he had no conception of it. He used it as a serving tray. He didn't see any essence, if you will, to use that loaded word, attached to this fan. He used it what it was in the present moment. If you gave it to Jason Bourne, it would be a weapon, right? If you gave it to, you know, I don't know, Neanderthal, he'd use it as kindling. I mean, you have all these different things, right? If you put it in an art museum, it could be in a gallery. So the idea is that there's no essential thing attached to this, that it empties. So in the same way, it empties itself of any concretized notion. And so how do we free ourselves from conceptual imprisonment of God on the absolute? Because I think that if we're able to do that, then we can really have interfaith dialogue. Because now we're not stuck in these claims to ultimacy. We're not saying, well, this is my idea of the infinite and of God. Well, this is mine, and now there's a barrier here already. There's no communication. Communication ends. If you've ever read anything by Krishnamurti, one thing I love that he does is that he says, okay, well, we're going to be talking about this topic, and if you already have a conclusion in your mind, well, that's it. Communication is over between us. But for those who are open, we can talk about it. Well, why does he say that? He says that because if you already have a conclusion in your mind at the very beginning, and you know where you're going, you already have, you've ended a dialogue. Now there's no openness. Now there's no real inquiry, because now you're just trying to lead into a certain direction. Furthermore, one thing I love that he does is he says, you know, you have all these people. I was especially in his time, searching for enlightenment, searching for salvation. And he says, well, how do you know that you want it? You don't know what it is. How do you know? Right? Because all you know are just other people's ideas of enlightenment, of salvation, of God. You're a second-hand human being. All you've been doing is you've been learning all this stuff your entire life, but you don't have any knowledge of it yourself. So, plenty of time. Love it. So in the same way, if we look at the absolute in that sense, if we look at God in that sense, how do we get beyond it? Well, we have to eliminate that conceptual imprisonment and free it of various connotations and notions and say, okay, we step back. And that's what these meditative traditions are for. These contemplations is to free the mind of conceptual imprisonment, of psychological attachment to various things, including our idea of God. If you search for it, you lose it. Because you're already searching for something. You're searching for a thing. So, I don't want to get too much into Nishida here because his language is incredibly complex. And there's only so much coffee that we can use to stay awake during Nishida. But in a sense, I look to Nishida to basically support the idea that the absolute must empty itself of any kind of essence, any kind of conceptual notion. And if it didn't, it would be a singularity. And there would be no diversity. There would be no diversity. Because once the absolute says this is what it is, and this is the best, this is the pinnacle, and this is it, now you've eliminated, and there's an other, you've eliminated otherness, because anything that God doesn't support, well, it doesn't exist. Because if God is infinite, anything that stands outside the infinite, now either you've equaled God, there's another infinite there, or it wasn't infinite in the first place. You can't stand outside the infinite. You just can't do it. I have yet to see someone try. So, with that said, there's one last thing I'd like to read to you, if I may. Let's see here. And this is a quotation from the book on the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are by Alan Watts. He says, in speaking and thinking of it, there is no alternative to the use of conceptions and images, and no harm in it so long as we realize what we're doing. Idolatry is not the use of images, but confusing them with what they represent. And in this respect, mental images and lofty abstractions can be more insidious than bronze idols. I love that line. So the really funny and paradoxical thing is that we have all these, if you will, conceptions of the infinite, and it's not like it's a sin. In fact, it's a kind of play. So what I've been doing here for the past 15 minutes, in a sense, is completely absurd. Because, in a sense, I'm going against my whole paper by standing, and so I could have just sat down, and that would have been it. But, boom, right there. That's my presentation. It's like a Zen koan. But the idea is that if, in a sense, it's okay to use language, to use thought, to have conceptions of God, of the absolute, of the Tao, so long as we realize that they're just tools to talk about it, that it's not the thing itself. It's just a form of play, it's a form of theater. We can't take it too seriously. Because once we do, now we start saying, well, this is my idea of God, and that's yours, and, well, sorry, we can't be friends. I have to defriend you on Facebook, you know? And that's the real kicker, right? I mean, once you're on Facebook, that's it. So that, to me, is if we really have to be aware, in my opinion, of how we're using our mind and not falling into these traps of conceptual imprisonment. And perfect timing, because I'll leave it open for questions for that.